So I am absolutely delighted to be joined by not just one Oppenheimer, but two Oppenheimers. One I've encountered on many occasions before, the other Mark Oppenheimer, the better Mark Oppenheimer. And I'm delighted to have his brother Daniel on. And we're going to be talking about what else but the movie Oppenheimer. So you get expert accounts on the greatest film of the year. Maybe someone will disagree with me on that front. What did you think, Mark?
What's the mass noun for Oppenheimer?
It's a mushroom cloud of Oppenheimers. I
A
mean, it's
cloud of
gotta be
Oppenheimers.
a cloud of Oppenheimers,
I
yeah.
think that's unimprovable. I think it's a cloud of Oppenheimers.
We do have a certain air about us as well.
That's the title of the episode right here, A Cloud of Oppenheimers.
I'm here in my underground lair, literally, and things are good in New Haven. The children are about to go back to school. I always like a week or a month in which I've seen two movies in the theater, and you can probably guess what those two movies are.
As you say, the two movies rivaling were Barbie and Oppenheimer. I made a point of watching both. I got myself in the Barbie like little booth and told everyone I was Barbenheimer impersonated, personified. Uh, which one would you want to rewatch after having watched both?
Barbie was a solid B+ movie. The parts I loved about it, that I loved more than anything in either movie, were the dance sequences, which I thought were totally brilliant, right up there with the Charlie's Angels movies, dance sequences with Cameron Diaz and whatnot. And I would happily rewatch those, and I do go to YouTube and rewatch those. But if I had to rewatch the entire movie, it would be Oppenheimer.
I think I'm gonna go with maybe the unpopular position, at least on this podcast, which is I enjoyed Oppenheimer the movie. It felt like this is my high level verdict. It felt like very well executed, well done, well acted, but it has not stayed with me. And to some extent, in some respects, Barbie has. I don't think I will seek out repeat viewings of Barbie, but if I'm in whatever, if it comes up on Netflix or it's just somebody else in my household is watching it, I can imagine sitting down to enjoy at least pieces of Barbie again. It has stayed with me in certain ways that Oppenheimer didn't. I was really impressed with Oppenheimer when I walked out of the theater, and then as the days have passed, I've become less and less excited by it while I respect its kind of execution.
Yeah, I have enormous sympathy for that view. Barbie is just this dazzlingly funny movie with these great lines, a lot of stuff delivered in a rapid fire way. One of the opening jokes I just loved as a lawyer, where you've got all the Barbies arguing before the Barbie Supreme Court, and they're arguing Citizens United, which is a little bit of a deep cut, and they're arguing that it should be different to the way it is in the real world. And that just immediately struck me as this is a smart movie. There's lots of stuff in there that I may not like, and a lot of people hate that film, but it felt like to me this would be a lot of fun on a second watch. Whereas Oppenheimer it's undoubtedly a great movie with some fantastic performances. It's quite a heavy movie, and there's arguably an hour that could be chopped out of it.
I think that it is a heavy movie, but Barbie is a heavy-handed movie, and I think that I was annoyed by parts of it and frustrated by how much better I thought it could have been if it had taken a somewhat lighter touch. I also and I don't know that this is an unpopular point of view, but I think it has to be said, I'm a very big believer that actors carry movies. Ultimately, it's a director's medium. The auteur is, I think, the most important person, but I think that it's hard to have a very compelling movie without really compelling actors, and I think Ryan Gosling is a much more compelling actor than Margot Robbie. I know that she's the great starlet of the past 10 years and the next 20 or 30 or 40, but Ryan Gosling, I every time I picture the movie, I picture him as Ken, I picture the dopey look on his face. He's having so much fun with it. I can't He made it a role that I can't imagine anyone else in, even though lots of actors presumably could have done a creditable job with it. Whereas with her, I have trouble conjuring up actually what she looks like, and maybe that's part of the point is that she ends up as generic blonde Barbiedom. But I just think that Ryan Gosling is the best thing about the movie, as he is in most movies that he's in. I have other thoughts on the acting in Oppenheimer, but I just want to put that out there about Barbie, which is I actually think it's less of an accomplishment for Greta Gerwig, though I think it's a pretty good movie, than for Ryan Gosling.
So I have a rival paradigm to put to that. I Most of the little individual pieces of that I agree with. I think the Kens in general stole the show vis-a-vis the Barbies, and Ryan Gosling was much better and more compelling than Margot Robbie. But at a higher sort of level of sort of filmic paradigm, I think what I would put up against your actors carry the movie is that old. I'm not going to get the terminology right because it's been a while since I read Pauline Kael, but that old sort of Pauline Kael perspective about how she'd rather take a sort of trashy hot mess of a movie, which I think in a lot of respects Barbie was, that has, I think the term was grace notes, that had moments of like real pop
Mm,
vitality and surprise over a sort of solidly done middle brow movie, which is where I feel like Oppenheimer ended up. And
okay.
I would say just temperamentally as I've gotten older, and I think I've always been a little bit privileged novelty more than maybe I should have, or more than taste justifies. But I felt like there was stuff in Barbie that felt new to me and fresh,
Yeah.
and Oppenheimer felt like exactly what I thought it was gonna
What you
be.
knew would be. Yeah.
And it was a well executed version of that and very well acted version of that. And if I had to grade it in some sense, I would give it a better grade than I would give Barbie. But I'm not, but these days with busy life, and maybe particularly with like busy life and kids, and it's not just about the sort of popcorn quality of it. It's just like my brain wants something new. And I felt like particularly with the Kens and like the stuff back and forth between Gosling and his rival Ken, like the Asian actor Simi Liu.
I'm just remembering the moment when they made me see Matchbox 20 in a way I'd never seen them before.
Very,
I never saw that song. It's Push, right? I'd never seen that
yeah,
song
as
as
like an
as a
abuse song.
as a bro anthem, and
Yeah,
until, of course, and now I'll never see it as anything but. Sorry, you were about to say something very
I was gonna,
profound.
I was gonna say something very very profound, not the opposite of profound, but I was going to connect it to another abiding film preoccupation of ours. Mark, we'll have to see if this resonates for you, which is my favorite character in Oppenheimer was David Krumholtz's
Oh,
character.
yeah. Freaking
And
Krumholtz, man. Krumholtz is out of this world.
Mark Oppenheimer, South African Mark Oppenheimer. Do you have a great David Krumholtz sort of feeling, vibe, affection?
What?
Is he a figure in major
How weird would that be if he did? If he was like, "Oh my god, I love Krumholtz."
Do you
Lots
know
of
who we're talking
Oppenheimer.
about? He wasn't even an important character.
He plays I Robbie, the Columbia, who, by the way, is important to my podcast Gatecrashers as one of the early tenured Jews at Columbia. He's a physicist who has tremendous misgivings, and he won't actually sign on. He does some work there, but he also doesn't want physicists to do this, and he's short and fat. Short.
Plays an important role, I would say, in the movie from a certain lens, which is they wanted Oppenheimer to be Jewish, and it was complicated because Cillian Murphy. It's not because he's not. It's not because he's not Jewish. It's just like I think Oppenheimer himself was one of these severe-looking German Jews who doesn't read as super Jewish to in general, but then to movie audiences. And so what do they like? The Krumholtz character and their bond serves the role of Jewifying Oppenheimer in the movie, which is actually important aside from my external affection for Krumholtz. That was my interpretation of kind of the role he played in the movie. And then maybe he even got a little more screen time in a sense. And part of it was his reservations about the use of the bomb, but I actually thought more important to the sort of structure of the film, or what Nolan was trying to do, was providing a vehicle for pointing out that Oppenheimer was Jewish. And
I have a lot to say about that. Like, if we're going to go on the Jewish angle, the Jewish tip, we will, and I'll bracket my thoughts on that. But before I forgot, I wanted to make this somewhat profound point, which is I can't actually remember the plot of Barbie. This is pushing back on you. You're like, "Oh, Barbie has transcendent grace notes. Ooh la la." It does. I agree with you. And yeah, like actually, maybe I would watch. It's shorter. It's punchier. I know I'll have some moments of awesomeness in it. And to watch Oppenheimer again would probably be a fairly lugubrious experience. So maybe I want to backtrack on that. On the other hand, Oppenheimer actually taught me an enormous amount of history in a really, really
yeah,
zippy, exciting way. Like, and I remember it all. Like, oh, so that interesting. So that's how they undid Oppenheimer, and that's how Louis Strauss was behind it all, and blah blah blah. Barbie, I have a sense that it was a satire in which men got their comeuppance. But if you actually pinned me down, especially if I had one drink in me or more, and said, "What's the plot again?" I'm not sure I can actually. I'd get it wrong in some very big way.
Well, it's the hero's journey, right? Barbie is reluctant. She gets forced out of Barbie Land, which is this paradise of sorts, and she has to go and save it reluctantly. And then ultimately goes through an internal journey where she becomes a real girl. And we all find out in a transphobic way that to be a woman is to have a vagina. That's the message of the movie.
wow, that was a brilliantly efficient synopsis of Barbie.
The South Africans have to be good at sort of at encapsulating complex moral questions in a soundbite. I think that's something they learned.
There's an interesting Jewish angle. I mean, you're talking about how Ryan Gosling steals the show, and the first time I encountered him was in this fantastic movie called The
The
Believer.
Believer,
Where
sure.
Yeah, he plays this Jewish neo-Nazi, and it's just such a like incredible story about anti-Semitism. There's this wonderful line where he talks about, why do people hate Jews? Is it because they're capitalists or because they're communists? Is it because they're greedy or they flash their money around? And he ultimately goes to the string of contradictions and says it's three letters, J-E-W, because they exist. And you've got him playing this very serious guy in a lot of films, and then it's just so goofy and fun in Barbie. And the I figured there's got to be some kind of Jewish light movie. I mean, you've got a trans Barbie, you got a black Barbie, you've got to have a Jewish Barbie.
First of all, let's spend a moment on Ryan Gosling and Judaism. As far as I know, not a Jew, big super goy. What's the movie, Dan, help me here, with Steve Carell and Emma Stone and
And Ryan Gosling, what the hell is that
Ryan
called?
Gosling, and I want
I
to call it
don't
As Good as It Gets, but it's not. It's anyway, that movie, which is a wonderful romantic comedy, Julianne Moore, it's one of the last great romantic comedies, I think. In that movie, Ryan Gosling plays a guy, they make him blonder than he is, and it's the handsomest he's ever been. He has a total six-pack stomach. He's an Adonis. He's a simple
Mhm.
Adonis. But he also has this kind of New York talk, and he's always using the word schwanz, which is like an even dirtier version of schmuck or putz. Like a schwanz is like, he's like, what am I, a schwanz here? You got your straw hanging out of your mouth like a schwanz. And it's so Jewy. Like, no, I didn't know the word. It's a deep, deep Yiddish cut. Like to talk about someone's member as their schwanz is like really old school. It doesn't exist anymore, really. And he's clearly coded as Jewish. Crazy
Crazy
Stupid
Stupid.
Love, which is a
Yep.
wonderful movie. And so it's interesting, like he's one of these guys, there's something about his affect, of course, his versatility, the fact that he's not too pretty, like he's plausible as ethnic if he plays it right and they do him up right. So yeah, there's I always think of him as something of an honorary Jew, and I also think he'd be happy to be one. I just feel that about him. In Oppenheimer, just little interesting point. In real life, according to my reading on Wikipedia, Louis Strauss didn't like Oppie because he felt that Oppie was trying to hide his Judaism, that he was too assimilated. Whereas Strauss, though a hyper reform, he was a German Jew, but he was a German Jew from West Virginia. He really wasn't to the manor born, but he played at being to the manor born. He ended up president of Temple Emmanuel in New York City, which is like the granddad of hyper reform German Jewish synagogues. But that is to say he was really interested in his Judaism, and he was interested in being a Jewish advisor to Roosevelt. He was very reformed. He wasn't super religious. He was anti-Zionist, as many reformed Jews were, but he was a Jew. And he felt Oppie was like a deracinated scientist who didn't care.
Mhm.
So in real life, there's a lot of sympathy for Strauss as a more Hamish figure, interestingly. In the movie, there's that moment where he says, well, it's not pronounced Strauss, it's Straws. And he says, well, it's the Southern pronunciation because he's from West Virginia. And Oppie says, Straws, Strauss, Oppenheimer, it's still Jewish to them or something like that. And Oppie, because he's the sympathetic character, he gets to be the Jewy one chiding Strauss for being assimilationist, but that's not the way it was. They do clue you into that. They twig you to that he is Jewish, but then they make Oppie the earthy Jew willing to own it. And Strauss has to be the like assimilated asshole because in the movie, he's the asshole, right?
The rap on Oppenheimer that he was a little self-loathing, or was it he was just a scientist, narcissist who didn't give a shit about, just wasn't into it?
In real life, there was no particular Jewish rap one way or the other on Oppenheimer. He was not self-loathing, but he was not interested. He was a scientist.
I mean, there's a line in the film where he says, the Nazis are doing terrible things to my people, and that's why I'm going to get involved in this project. And that it looms large that we are racing against the Nazis, that if they get the bomb, that is the worst possible event, not just because they're invading parts of Europe, but because of what they're doing to my people, to the Jews. And it's such an interesting race that you have, and you sort of get this sort of, the Germans, ahead at sometimes, and maybe they're, behind at others. And then the Americans developed the bomb, but at that point, Hitler shot himself in the head.
Right.
And so the scientists said, well, we can all go home now. I mean, the moral force of us building this bomb, well, it doesn't matter anymore. And then the politicians say, well, we spent a lot of money building this fantastic gadget that you guys have been working on at our expense, and we'd really like to see how it works. I mean, we've already firebombed the Japanese with other things, and we killed hundreds of thousands of them anyway. Can't we see what our little toy does? Wouldn't that be fun? And that's such a nice tension in the film, playing with that Oppenheimer's Jewish loyalty, the reason for doing it, that being taken away and then still this impetus to drop the bomb on civilians.
It became a very complicated movie for me in ways that I didn't think it would be. I thought that part of it was really good. And for you as a philosopher, that must have been really exciting that you could show that clip to ethics classes, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, if you're a classical rights theorist and you think you cannot use people as a means to an end, then the idea that you can sacrifice hundreds of thousands of civilians for a greater good of, let's say, saving lots of American soldiers' lives, it's unacceptable. If you're doing a utilitarian calculation, you say, well, we can end the war early and we'll save 1 million lives. Well, then it seems more palatable. But a lot of people really don't like the idea of killing innocents. But I'd say for most of history, the view Hiroshima and Nagasaki were perfectly justifiable. And maybe that's a winners get to write the rules view.
Yeah, as a sort of the loose philosophical framework, I end up applying to that myself. And this is in the absence of kind of sufficient knowledge about the history, because I think there is a kind of revisionist perspective that says, and I think they'd even got a little bit of voice in the film, that the Japanese were actually on the verge of surrender anyway. I think that could be a compelling claim. I think what's not compelling to me in a sort of maybe in a sort of Machiavellian sense is there's some fundamental way in which it's just impossible to imagine the leadership of a nation being unwilling to use a weapon like that when the alternative is a long protracted war. So even if the sort of pure utilitarian calculus is, oh well, we're going to kill 250,000 Japanese, it would have only cost 20,000 American lives to push them to surrender had we not used the atomic bomb. Like, that's just an utterly infeasible political calculation. There's no president, king, emperor, prime minister, I think, in the history of great powers who would have refused to use a weapon like that when the alternative. That doesn't answer the question in a sort of global sense, but it leaves me feeling like worrying at it too much is a little bit stupid. Like, it feels utopian to me. Now, if there was a plausible case that the Japanese were on the verge of surrender, I don't think there's no number too small where it would have been worth fighting it out in an invasion and costing some American lives. But if the number's getting up into thousands, tens of thousands, it's irrelevant. Like, that's what we're going to do.
I agree. And I'm not sure that's wrong. I have some sympathy for that because I do think we're stuck with nation states as the best possible organization amongst all the bad possible organizations of a world population of however many billion. And I think for them to have some legitimacy, they do have to value the lives of their own citizens above other lives. And I'm saying not only do I think as a matter of empirical claim, they will, but I think they probably ought. Otherwise, what are they doing? And I don't trust the one nation state utopian overlord in which the UN gets to make all the decisions. I don't think that ends well for the Jews, among others, by the way. And so I was not moved by the question that they should prolong the war, whoever thought that in the movie. But the other thing that occurs to me, which I don't think they talked about so much, is I imagine that they also felt the Russians have to see what the bomb can do, and the Germans have to. Everyone who's going to be part of the New World Order after the war has to see what the bomb can do. And in the event where the Russians got the H bomb and we got the H bomb, in the event it's probably not so important. Everyone knew and everyone got the bomb. But at the moment, they're probably thinking it's not enough to theoretically have the bomb if we're going to end up back at odds with the communists once this alliance ends. It's important that people understand what we can do. And I don't know. I don't know enough about world history to have strong feelings about that, but I have to think that was part of the calculus.
Was there another site where they could have tested it, where it would have killed 200 people, but made a big mushroom cloud, and that would have served the same purpose? Or if it didn't force the Japanese surrender, then we could be like, hey, by the way, look at that thing we just did. Like, get ready for another one if you don't surrender. I think those are totally viable counter arguments, I think.
There is this calculus that's made explicit in the film, which is this is the bomb to end war. That once you see its might, that it becomes totally and utterly irrational to engage in any other warfare because you can be extinguished. And there is an interesting thing that happens, right? I mean, it is the only time that a nuclear bomb has ever been dropped on people. I mean, it's been tested. Americans and Russians have obviously accumulated a large number of weapons. There's a concern, a nation like Iran would have nuclear weapons and use it to destroy a place like Israel. But we haven't ever had another nuclear war. And of course, this is something that I think looms large in people's minds over the last year and a half is what if Russia decides to drop a nuke on Ukraine? I think the Ukrainians probably feel like they shouldn't have given up their nuclear weapons. That if they didn't, they would have had some real threat against the Russians. And this mad strategy of if you dump on me, I'm going to dump on you, and we'll all kill each other, does seem at the moment to have worked. No one's dropping nukes on each other.
Certainly didn't make war itself unimaginable, right? It made certain kinds of war less imaginable. I'm not sure if that was I'm not sure if that was the claim in the movie, or the sort of a overly optimistic claim of Oppenheimer or whomever, that it would literally render war unimaginable because you couldn't imagine a Vietnam.
Well, I suppose the claim is that nuclear powers don't go to war against each other once everyone has seen what it can do. And that's true, I
Like a
think.
world war, like a certain kind of world war is less imaginable.
Well, I think nuclear powers now only fight each other by proxy wars, right? Like Vietnam and now Ukraine and stuff. Suez, everything Israel's involved in, where the Russians arm the other side and we arm Israel. There's lots of proxy wars. Here's the other thing is, and this is contra Robbie, who was hoping that physics would never be used to this end. Once they were this close to the technology, it was inevitable, right? There was never, I guess you can control the fission material, and so in that way you can keep, there's a sense in which there's a worldwide arms control, but knowledge doesn't stop advancing. This is the problem that we have with AI right now, which strikes me as bad news for humanity. Even if you don't believe the apocalyptic visions, it'll just coarsen our lives and make them worse in all sorts of ways, and already has, right? Every time I call Amtrak and I have to talk to the stupid AI voice, it's really hard to stop all smart people interested in a particular scientific problem from working on that problem. And so once nuclear fission became an interesting problem, I wonder if there's a sense of inevitability, and it does make sense to, if you think that you're a better actor than some of the other characters out there will be, to rush to be the first and the best at it. I don't know the answer to that. I think you both know that I'm a bit of a Luddite, and I wish we probably have enough technology. We should go cure the common cold. There's a few other things that medicine can do, but otherwise probably stop. But that's not how it works, right?
I mean, do you think there should be restrictions on what scientists go and research? I mean, the one view is that there's certain questions you should never ask because they might yield terrible results. And the other view is to say scientists must be free to do whatever they want. They can research however they want, and the ethicists can produce reasons not to use that research. But the scientists must be unencumbered. Because here you have these moralizing scientists in the film who are caught between what they should be doing, what the consequences of their actions will be.
Once you were at the point we were, where we're racing against the Germans, right? Like there really was no political choice at that point, but to race against, out of fear that the Germans would develop it first. So once you were at that point of development, I think there was no putting the cat back in the bag. I don't know enough about the science. If you're in a situation with chemical or biological weapons or AI, like I think there's a really good case to be made that at least you try to bring into existence a kind of international weapons control regime that really limits some of these research. And that is the case, at least when you're dealing with technologies that are very, very difficult, practically speaking, to develop, right? So
Right.
there's the scientific information about an atomic bomb on the one hand. On the other hand, the reason that only states have atomic bombs is it's actually really fucking hard to build an atomic bomb, and there's limited amounts of material, and we can be aware with radar and satellites and all of these things about where these facilities are and at what stage they are. And I think it's similarly the case with certain kinds of biological and chemical weapons. I think one of the tricky things with AI is it's not 100% clear. Like once you get down to the level of like individual people with a nice computer can actually do something,
Right.
or even like a small supercomputer or something, then the keeping the cat in the bag thing gets increasingly difficult. If we were all sufficiently scared shitless by let's say the apocalyptic AI scenario, like China and the US and the big European powers and whomever else got together, in Japan and Taiwan, and said, hey, we're just going to stop, or we're going to actually think maybe we could. It's not going to happen because nobody's sufficiently scared. And there, at least the short-term calculations are such that it makes more sense to develop it than not develop it. But it's not totally obvious to me, in theory, we couldn't control something like that. I think the problem is, unlike an atomic bomb or like biological weapons, engineered super viruses or things like that, the threat of AI is pretty abstract for a lot of them.
Right. And they did, of course, with weapons, come together with all sorts of accords, and that has worked pretty well. There's been no other bomb dropped.
Also going to say on your point, Mark, about like, well, maybe it's rendered world wars unviable or unimaginable. I guess even if I granted that, I'd still probably take world wars with conventional weapons over the possibility of total annihilation.
What do you think about an alternate history where America is the only state that ever developed nuclear weapons?
Well, so here
So,
I actually have a story. My grandmother, who, as Dan knows, because she was his grandmother too, who had, now confirmed, had Communist Party membership in the United States in the 30s and maybe into the 40s. And it's hard to say that she certainly didn't have a Stalinist soul. She was like a super sweetie. And I think she briefly had a Stalinist politics. You know, this was her point of view, at least as I gather from my mom. So there's a bit of a game of telephone going here, so she could be rolling over in her grave. But that and this was apropos of the Rosenbergs and other people who either spied or conspired to spy and get atomic secrets to the Russians, it was seen as absolutely unacceptable that the United States be the only power with the bomb, that somehow truly horrible things were going to happen there. And in that claim that there is something that having an extremely good deterrent is actually an offensive move, that when nobody can get at you because of your deterrent power, that you can then do whatever you want, which, by the way, is the argument that a lot of people very skeptical of Israel or anti-Zionist make about the Iron Dome defense system in Israel, which is that when you can shoot down all of Hamas's rockets, that's not a defensive strategy. That's the precondition for all kinds of offensive things you want to do. Then you can go, some people would say, harvest organs or murder babies or whatever calumnies they want to level against Israel, but also things that definitely do happen, right?
Well, how else are we supposed to make the matzah, Mark?
Right, exactly. So right, there is a theory that like there's no such thing as a defensive weapon, because if your defensives get good enough, then you're liberated to do all sorts of absolutely unthinkable offensive things. And I think this was certainly the theory, right? Which is the United States couldn't be allowed to have massive deterrent power, because then what does it do? It just goes and deposes even more dictators. And I don't know. I still believe that despite all of truly the war crimes and all of the immoral interventions in foreign countries that didn't want us meddling, despite all of that and granting all of that, that the world in which Russia acts as confidently as it acted for half a century is a worse world. I think I would have, if I had to reimagine an alternative history, I let just us have the bomb.
Whether or not the result was a better or worse of this kind of alternate parallel history where we have the bomb, whether it's a better or worse world vis-a-vis our interventions in Russia and Russia's internal, totalitarian politics, like, I guess I'd probably take just us having the bomb anyway, because you read about these instances where we were close, whether it's like an actual political conflict like the Cuban Missile Crisis, or isn't there this story about like there was like a misfire on radar and it came down to like one Russian submarine captain or something who had to decide whether to follow protocol, in which case he would have fired nuclear missiles at us.
Or are you thinking of the Idris Elba show Hijack, in which they're about to shoot down the plane, but you know that maybe they'll disobey orders?
Yeah, it's in there. Everything that I've done over the past 2 months has been inflected in some way by the Idris Elba show. But it's what I was saying about like with the world wars, which is I'll take an increased risk of world war if it decreases the risk of nuclear war, because it's just like we can recover from a lot, but we can't recover from like a poisoned atmosphere and a decimated planet or something like that. And I will take conventional misery and atrocity over just catastrophic civilization ending catastrophe most days of the week. So yes to U.S. being a unipolar power. I think when we were, and it's not that it's the same thing, but after the demise of the Soviet Union, and we were the sort of sole hegemon, though we weren't, it wasn't as lopsided as it would have been if we had nukes and nobody else did. We acted poorly, and there's no question about that, but we acted poorly again in sort of normal imperial hegemonic ways that, maybe easy for me to say from the US and not from Baghdad, but
Look, I mean, the wonderful thing about America is that you've only ever had saints as president. Clearly, all the people in power can be totally trusted. And if they were the only ones with nukes, I can't see a bad thing happening there at all.
What did you think of Oppenheimer?
Yeah. So one of the lines in it that I found really interesting was the two different trial processes that are going on, and that are meant to speak to each other. So I found it interesting as a lawyer thinking about these processes that happen outside of a formal court. And one of the things that's mentioned is that there's these surprise tactics, that there isn't this ability to cross-examine, that procedural justice is seen as being really important, and that if you lose out on it, you get the outrageous outcomes. And the story between Strauss and Oppenheimer that kind of sets the wheels in motion for Oppenheimer's demise, but that ultimately it costs him the thing that he wants most, which is a cabinet position. That's in that setting, and he's constantly told, "This isn't a court. We're allowed to do what we like. This is a congressional hearing." He then feels that he's robbed of the procedural justice, and I found that interesting to watch as a lawyer. But as I said right up front, was that the movie struck me as something that could have been an hour shorter, and I wondered, would it be a much worse movie if all of those sequences that are shot in black and white, all of the Strauss congressional hearings weren't in the movie, and it was a 2-hour film instead of a 3-hour film? Would you feel like you'd watch something much worse? Because really, the Strauss story is interspersed throughout. It adds a contrast. It's this kind of poetic ending to the injustice he does to Oppenheimer, maybe add some spice to the hearing that's held in that sort of tiny little office. But if you chopped it out, I don't think you'd miss anything in the Oppenheimer story. No problem with the performances, like it's an interesting thing, but the movie does get sluggish at times. And my usual critique of a film is that it's always a little bit too long. And Oppenheimer at times feels very long, in a way that Barbie feels largely like a bullet train.
I I disagree. I was surprised at how appropriately lengthed it felt to me. And I think I like a movie that goes big. They're not always movies I'll see again. I don't want to see Gandhi again. The way I don't reread the long novels. I know some people do. Some people can't wait to reread 1,000 pages of Dickens or Proust or whatever. I like I sometimes like having read them, even though I'm not going to reread them. Though I've never read Proust, let me be clear. And but there's room for the 3-hour movies. I do feel like I felt like I swallowed up a world that's living inside me now, and it was done in a way that I really remember it and understand it. And in a way, I almost wish that Barbie had a little more ambition. Like, maybe it was a little too short. As I said, it could have been a musical and a satire on a lot of things. It could have had a few more really fun dance numbers. I loved it when they had the dance numbers at the beginning, then I loved it when they did Push as the guitar macho bro. I felt like they didn't look, you don't want a movie to stick around too long. It's good that it leaves you wanting more. So to its great credit, left me wanting more. But I don't feel that all my movies have to be an hour 40 or an hour 50. And I think that this one because you need to understand Strauss in all his fullness to understand it sets up the greatness of the cohort amongst Einstein and Oppenheimer and the physicists, right? That he's ultimately a shoe salesman, nothing against shoe salesman, but he feels inferior for being a shoe salesman. And they are great minds. And yeah, that's a conceit, and it doesn't mean they're great people. But I think that's what you get from having all those other scenes in there.
I don't mind the length necessarily, and I think in a way we've become more accommodating of longer form entertainment. If you think about binge watching a show on Netflix, you can sit there for 6 hours and be, completely captive. Succession is this 40-hour story. The way that Oppenheimer starts is so compelling. It just brings you into this world. I watched it on IMAX, and the sound and the look of it is just amazing.
Did Nolan do Dunkirk?
Yep.
That's like one of the best movies I've ever seen, and it's mysterious to me that that's not a much discussed, newly canonical movie. And also, I thought when I walked out of it, wow, that's a really nationalist conservative movie. That's a Tory movie. And a couple people pointed that out. And there's a way in which this movie too is a little bit of a Tory movie, is a little bit of sometimes you have to go kill people for your country. It's a nationalist movie. There's a read of it that's quite Tory in its way.
I found the sort of resolution where Strauss got negged from that cabinet position because he'd screwed Oppenheimer somewhat rewarding. I never did understand, and I'm not, this isn't really a fault of the movie. I never really did understand in the context of the movie why that security clearance hearing was so significant. In other words, he didn't go to jail.
I think it was the ignominy of being stripped of his security clearance. Just that now it's news that J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, was suspect enough in communist sympathies in 1950, early 50s, whenever that was, that he was stripped of security clearance. In the context of McCarthyism,
There's probably some part of me that's experiencing it from the lens of somebody who lives in these sort of hyper polarized times. Well, okay, well, somebody went after Oppenheimer, like he got dinged, but yeah, that's what people do, right? It doesn't diminish the esteem of the person because some asshole government, because some deep state people took him down a peg in this sense.
right?
It's not that it wouldn't have been significant, but I think the assumption was in the movie that it was life destroying in a way. And I believe that it was in context. I just didn't totally process that emotionally in the context of the movie.
I want to say for the record, this is an extraordinarily well cast movie. When you have Matt Damon popping up as Major Groves, and the choice of actors who are known for theatrical chops and ones who are a little more obscure, and when you have Krumholtz in as I, Robbie, when you have Matt Damon, when you have Casey Affleck in that small role, I didn't even realize that was Robert Downey Jr. until I went home and Googled it. I thought, who played Louis Strauss? It's Robert Downey Jr. Holy cow! And in a million years, having seen a lot of Peaky Blinders, I wouldn't have thought that, what's his name? Cillian? What's his name?
Killian.
Cillian Murphy. Never would have occurred to me. And then I'm seeing news briefs or little commentaries before the movie comes out. Cillian Murphy, who bears an uncanny resemblance to Oppenheimer. And I'm thinking, no, he doesn't. He just played it well. What I'm going to see is good makeup and a great performance so that by the end, you think that's what Oppenheimer looked like. But I don't think Cillian Murphy looks like J. Robert Oppenheimer. But it was just a really smartly cast movie in so many. It was Matt Damon in his beefier mode, like certain parts he beefs up for.
Yeah.
There's like Jason Bourne mode, and then there's beefier mode, and I don't know. It's just every time someone came on screen, I thought, well, that's a coup.
So there's two things we haven't talked about that I'm keen on. The one is Oppenheimer as a womanizer. Right? I mean, in that opening part of the movie, he's this Lothario, right? He's like going after other guys' wives. He's got this young mistress who kills herself because she's so much in love with him. Florence Pugh is phenomenally gorgeous in the film and puts in a great performance. So I'm interested to know what you guys think about that. There's a series about Einstein called Genius, and it starts there with Jeffrey Rush having sex with a mistress. That's the sort of opening thing, the idea that maybe these great Jewish intellectual geniuses are also fantastic bed, something that can buff up our egos. And the other bit is, Daniel, I mean, you've written about, people on the left who move over to the right, and the McCarthyism in the film is something that kind of looms, right? This sort of idea of, the liberal Americans are fighting the Nazis, and then suddenly overnight, the big threat are the communists. And we need to find out who they are because they could absolutely ruin our nation. And so that's the kind of most powerful thing about the Strauss hearings, really, is the McCarthyism stuff that looms in.
I actually thought Oppenheimer's womanizing was handled with a relatively light touch in a sense. I think wasn't there a scene towards the end where something maybe came up in the sort of security clearance hearing where it turned out he was sleeping with there was some reference to another colleague's wife from he was sleeping with it. It was the first time that had come up in the context, and there were some interactions. Context of the movie, there were some interactions at some parties where there was obvious sexual tension between him and another woman, and wasn't clear whether the implication was that he was actually sleeping with her or would be sleeping with her, but it was more just I thought it was well done and in a sort of not usefully moralizing way. I thought it was interesting to me in the context back to what we were saying at the beginning of thinking of him as a Jewish character, because there's some sense in which his fundamental don't think it's a stock Jewish type in the sort of American pop cultural imagination. It's not that it's hard for me to believe he was Jewish. I just didn't experience him in some fundamental way as a Jewish character. Not that there are plenty of Jewish womanizers that are stock characters in the cultural imagination. It's just not that. And I didn't think that was a problem. And he was who he was. And I appreciated that he didn't have to be slotted into some pre-existing stereotype of what a Jewish character or a Jewish lead would be. But it was interesting for me to think about. I kept thinking about him. Does he feel Jewish to me right now? In what meaningful sense? If he does, is it really because I'm just imposing some pre-existing construct on top of behavior that doesn't really fit into that?
Mark was waiting for him to masturbate into a piece of liver, pulling a full Alexander Portnoy.
I wonder if some of your confusion or struggles with figuring out how this fit with his character is that we're not used to scientists being depicted as Lotharios. And we've all heard that Einstein had mistresses, and I've heard this. I knew only this much about Oppenheimer, not much more. And it seems to me that when you really read about scientists, a lot of them were men who weren't faithful, as a lot of men haven't been faithful, maybe more or less than the average non-scientific person. But the United States, in its pop culture anyway, has such a strong stock stereotype of the scientist as a socially awkward, nerdy misfit. A stereotype that, by the way, predates all the thinking we now have about certain people who aren't neurotypical but might have some extraordinary strengths in certain areas, but might not have great social acumen in others, right? But so the idea that he's actually totally brilliant in a bafflingly weird way, can master Dutch in a matter of weeks, and also knows exactly how to charm a lady at a party in full view of his wife, is not the kind of thing in American pop culture a lot.
Yeah. Think about who some of the other scientists were. You've got Josh Hartnett, who is his buddy. You have a bunch of scientists, a few of whom, some of whom fit into the scientist nerdy stereotype, but a bunch of them don't. They're just strapping, charming, American alpha male types who also happen to be utterly brilliant physicists.
Who are then put on a ranch out in the West and given lots of cowboy scenes. They're basically cowboys. And one of the things Christopher Nolan is doing is saying, these guys were strapping alpha males for better and for worse. They were cowboys. And they erected a cowboy town in the middle of nowhere with like a saloon and all of it, right? That's what it looks like, is an old West town. So that was really interesting. The other thing I'll say, it's not deep film criticism in any way, is I actually don't know any, among my friendship circle, any adult males or females who have a lot of extramarital dalliances. And I'm sure they're out there. We've all read the statistics. But when I see these things in pop culture, even though I know that perhaps this was more acceptable or done more or more forgiven, rightly or wrongly, 25 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, I don't know. I'm still a little bit in disbelief that there was that much cheating going on and that much tolerance of cheating. We actually live in a fairly less puritanical now because there's so many people who are out about being poly. But you and I, all three of us, I say, grew up in times that were very puritanical about this stuff, right? You didn't, as a teenager, you didn't date lots of people until you asked one of them to go steady. You dated serially. And so I just watch this stuff and it just looks like Mars to me.
Because we're all nice Jewish boys.
I have a lot of Gentile friends, and I don't know any of them who I think are not faithful, who are not monogamous.
I mean, I keep hearing these stats about Americans not having sex.
Yeah. Let me inject a note of skepticism into that. I think what you can more reliably say is you don't have any who are flamboyantly, outwardly promiscuous. I think there's still plenty of affairs. I think they happen on the down low, and they're not particularly tolerated by the cultures in which people move, right? And that's true. Like, I think academic culture was once one that was pretty tolerant of being a sort of pretty flamboyantly promiscuous person. It's not anymore. So I think you don't know, and most of us don't know who of our friends are cheating on their partners or have cheated on their partners, because when they're doing it carefully and quietly.
I'm sure that's right.
They're not telling you about it because they don't expect you to approve. And they expect you to tell your wife, and they know that she's not going to approve. And
basically, Dan's saying in Austin, things are much more swinging than they are in Connecticut.
Oh,
no, it's exactly what Mark said. It's like this weird mix of, like, on the one hand, total tolerance of a million different alternative lifestyles, which I support, but also coexisting utterly with just a pretty sexless, actual, visceral experience of the world and culture and communities. Same in Austin.
Now, that said, I do believe that Austin is more swinging than anywhere in Connecticut, to be sure.
Even Greenwich, even is that where the ice storm was sent?
Austin, we've talked about this. People have hot tubs outside in Austin. That would be weird up here.
Yeah, that may be true, and I'm just not privy to. Well, there was the one great hot tub party at our neighbor's house, which we won't go into details.
We won't get into that.
What was your other question, Mark? It was about the sort of Cold War context of the movie.
It's this sort of big part of the film, right? Is Oppenheimer a secret communist? It plays this role in, can we trust him? He never signs up to the Communist Party, but he funnels funds to Spain through the Communist Party, that he's romantically involved with communists. It's as you kind of told from a Tory lens of that would be a really bad thing if you were actually a communist, right? And there's a sense in which, like, your grandmother was a communist, but maybe not in the sense of knowing all the horrible stuff that Stalin was doing to people. And, people thought about communists fighting the fascists. And, if you think about Putin's war now in Ukraine, he described it as fighting neo-Nazis.
Look, I think the movie was very good on that front. It was very good about the fact that some people were really hardcore and some people were really hardcore about the Spanish Republicans, but not about other stuff going on, and how complicated it really was, especially given that so much of this was in the context of the American Depression, when capitalism, legitimately was being questioned as the only possible future for the United States. So I think it was quite sophisticated on that front. And actually, given that it was a British filmmaker, I think remarkably so. One thing it made me thought is that the book by Kai Bird and Martin Sherman, is that his name? That the biography, American Prometheus, is probably fabulous.
Yeah, my wife Jessica read it. She said it was great. Yeah, I think that's right. To your point, Mark, about Nolan being British, I think that had an interesting effect on me, which is, yes, it's impressive that he did it with a great degree of sophistication. I also think it made it, and in a good way, he probably didn't. Part of the reason some of that didn't resonate is the wrong word. Part of why I'm having a hard time coming up with things to say than you would think I would, given that I've written a lot about that stuff, is that he just wasn't operating in some of the modes that I think an American filmmaker would be more likely to have operated in. Like, we don't see Joseph McCarthy. I'm not sure if we hear his name. The sort of anti-communism is of a kind of a relatively bureaucratic sort. It's not some vicious mouth breather who's even the ills that people are suffering as an effect of anti-communism are not that grievous in a sense, right? It's Oppenheimer losing a security clearance. It's Strauss in some sense downstream of that, not getting confirmed. And as the commerce secretary or whatever, so it just didn't hit the beats I would have expected it to hit. And so I think it's been a little bit harder to integrate into my sort of internal take machine because of that. Because I think Nolan's just not telling the story from the perspective of the sort of standard narrative structures and beats that you hit when you're telling a McCarthyism story. Unlike what was the Edward R. Murrow movie, the Good Night and Good Luck, the Clooney movie. It just feels different because it's like Nolan, and I don't think he necessarily lives in that imaginative space. And I don't think that has even been where this has really even been where he's lived as a sort of filmmaker, right? Does he have other films that are so much in this sort of historical, political, intellectual space? I think of him as the dude who did like
Memento.
Memento and Inception and the Batman movies. And it's not that he's not political. He is political, but it's a very different kind of political.
So nice that you refer back to some of his other work. One of the comments that I saw about Oppenheimer was that it's an unusual structure because it moves around in time, and has all these different narratives that are interspliced. And if I think about some of Nolan's other films, they really push that hard. Memento, when I saw it in cinema, just completely blew me away. The idea that you could tell this movie in two different directions, just so powerful. Or his most recent film before this was Tenet, which is this time traveling film and really plays with time. And Interstellar as well kind of plays with this idea of time and space. And he's an intellectual filmmaker. There's some really interesting philosophical thought that goes into the films. And in a sense, for me, Oppenheimer felt like quite a standard film in comparison to his other stuff. But maybe for someone who's used to a normal biography, it was somehow otherworldly.
Its use of jumping back and forth between time and even black and white and color felt like pretty standard narrative techniques to me, like used well. Yes, and I've seen some of the other Nolan movies, which are much trippier. It did not seem in the same vein as that.
It was loud. Like Dunkirk, it was super loud. His movies are loud. He's got like Rick Rubin mixing them.
It's sad. It's sad as a film goer that a movie like Dunkirk, which I didn't see and didn't know that I should see, it's not that I can't see it on a big TV or something like that, but presumably it's a movie that you really would want to see in a theater with a big screen. And I will literally never be able to see that movie in a big screen because it's probably also not quite artsy enough or not credited as being artsy enough that it will even show up at the sort of Austin Film Society where they play classics and things like that. So I will never see that movie in the sort of context in which it should be seen.
There's something
Which
to say about Nolan. All his movies are big screen movies.
Yeah, I think that's right. As much as Memento is a kind of intimate film in a way and made on a small budget, it warrants that seeing in a cinema. I mean, it completely blew me away. I watched it when I was still a teenager, and I was just completely gobsmacked by it. And there's something about seeing a film in cinema for the first time. It had this magical effect.
You watched it when you were just a little oppy?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Did you, by the way, did Mark, you said you saw it in IMAX. I saw it on a regular screen. I wonder if it lost some. Did you feel seeing it in IMAX like you got some extra 20% or
I
something
I don't have a great sense of IMAX versus to me, it's theater versus TV. No, I think you probably got the full experience. I think the mushroom cloud was still pretty mushroomy.
I will say on the question of Oppie, that was the biggest sort of just personal thrill I got in the movie was the Oppie. When they're chanting Oppie, that feels very
That felt
personal,
awesome.
right? That was awesome. Like when in
Wait,
your
let me guess.
effort,
You were back on the wrestling mat at
I,
Choate your senior year, winning New England's in 145 pounds, or was it 152? Hearing them shout
145. Yeah.
145, hearing them shout Oppie on the sidelines, right? That's where it took you back. It took you back to peak Oppie, high school peak Oppie.
How long is the Oppenheimer effect going to last in terms of people being able to pronounce and spell our name properly? Is it going to be eternal, or will it just like in a year, is it going to be back to the miserable status quo?
Well, here's the thing. There's no historicity anymore, right? So for people who live in this moment, who are consumers of pop culture in this moment, it might last a while. But people who begin seeing movies even 1 year from now because there's no predicting what they will mine the past for, right? They might be very conversant on Welcome Back, Kotter and I Love Lucy and have no idea that 2 years ago, Oppenheimer was one of the movies of the year. So it'll be very hit or miss if younger generations learn anything from it. But I have to think that of people who are living in this moment, it should buy us some time of not having to spell our name as much.
I did remember something very Jewish about the Barbie movie that we didn't touch on, which is the woman who invented Barbie, played by Rhea Perlman
Rhea Perlman.
in the
Oh,
movie.
yeah.
But the woman who invented Barbie was a Jewess, as you might
Yes.
say, Mark.
Yes, she was. And what's interesting is I've had some older Jews say to me in the past few weeks how great it is that it's now been revealed that Barbie was Jewish.
Huh.
And there's no part of me that thinks that she was trying to somehow code a Jewish doll.
Well, no, this goes back to just the larger discussion of the ways in which Jews have created this sort of modern American WASP kind of iconography, right? So
Well,
like Ralph Lauren creates preppy style, and whoever it was who created Superman, and Ruth Handler creates Barbie. They're not creating coded Jews, but they're doing some important cultural foundational work.
and the most famous surfer ever is Gidget, who's based on a real life Jewish girl from Southern California who was a surfer. So they gave us surf culture in a sense, in the big popular sense of it.
I was thinking about why the Kens stole the show for me in Barbie. And one of the conclusions I came to was, and this very much has to do with like the challenges facing contemporary filmmakers, is they were able to have a lot more fun with the Kens being absurd and silly and pathetic in certain ways that I think gave them more texture. And I think because of our fears of misrepresenting women or misogynistically or sexistly representing women, that like the Barbies were really flat, right? So in one sense, you had the Barbie of every skin tone, you had the Barbie in a wheelchair, but at the same time, they were like slight, sort of very vanilla hints of ethnicity. But basically, and characterologically, they were all just indistinguishable from each other. And I think because Kens are, in a sense, even if they're of a different race, they are sort of alpha males, and we can have fun with alpha males. There was just more playfulness in the representation of the
I think
Kens.
that's right. The exception to flatness in the Barbies being the one who's in the weird
Weird
Barbie
Barbie.
playhouse, Kate McKinnon, who's fabulous, but I don't vibe to creepy goth scissorhands type characters, male or female. So I was, and then I didn't think America Ferrera's speech was as compelling as some people thought it was. So that whole weird Pee Wee's Playhouse scene didn't work for me, but that was where they tried to complicate the Barbie character. and it fell flat for me. So that was probably the moment for me when the movie fell from A minus to B plus, though not a college B plus, which would be like an F in days of grade inflation, like a B plus back when B plus really was a good grade anyway.
How did you take the Barbie espionage where they try and overthrow the patriarchy through their kind of plot to infiltrate the Kens? I thought there's some really funny moments in there. One of which is the Kens. They say that they were going to play the songs at the Barbies, and they're going to explain The Godfather to them while they're watching it. And I just thought some of that stuff was absolutely hilarious and pretty
That was
accurate.
great. Yeah, that was
It
great.
it was. I just like I didn't remember it till you told me because all I can remember are the cool dance sequences at the beginning, plus the Matchbox 20 moment, plus the Indigo Girls moment, Closer to Fine, which warms the heart of any Gen Xer.
This was absolutely fabulous. It's been a dream to have both Oppenheimer brothers in the same space at the same time. I had to travel to very different parts of your amazing nation to see you, and so wonderful to do this together.